If you add up the value of Apple, Amazon, and Saudi Aramco today, you get a staggering sum of wealth. But their combined resources still fall short of a single company founded 4 centuries ago. Adjusted for inflation, the Dutch East India Company reached a peak valuation of $7.9 trillion. It remains the wealthiest commercial enterprise in recorded history. This 18th century botanical illustration highlights the physical assets behind that wealth, the dried buds of cloves and the seeds of nutmeg trees. These food flavorings were the primary commodities of a multi-trillion-dollar trade. European demand for these specific tastes was so intense that it financed global conquest, building a military and commercial monolith that eventually controlled entire regions and thousands of ships. By the late 1500s, the spice trade was highly lucrative but exceptionally dangerous. The Portuguese Empire held a tight grip on the primary sea routes, forcing competitors to risk their ships, lose their capital, and their lives. Independent Dutch merchants tried to break into this market anyway. They formed temporary pre-companies and launched expeditions into the Indian Ocean. While a few of these multi-year voyages returned large profits, many ships were swallowed by storms or sunk in combat. Even when these independent Dutch traders survived the journey, they ended up competing against one another at the ports. They bid up the purchase price of spices in Asia and undercut each other's selling price back in Europe, destroying their own profit margins. In 1602, the leading statesman of the Dutch Republic, Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, intervened. He forced these competing merchants into a single state-sponsored merger and granted the new entity a 21-year monopoly on all Asian trade. The Dutch government recognized that fighting the Portuguese for global supremacy required massive scale. To survive the brutal realities of intercontinental trade, they engineered a unified, state-backed giant. Before a single ship could set sail, this new company had to solve a funding crisis. They needed 6.4 million guilders to outfit their initial fleet. To raise that sum, they opened investment to the general public, allowing any citizen of the Dutch Republic to buy a share. This flowchart illustrates their solution: permanent capital. In previous expeditions, merchants liquidated everything as soon as a ship returned. The VOC did the opposite. Once a citizen put money into the central company vault, it stayed locked inside to fund future voyages. Because investors could no longer withdraw their capital, they needed a way to liquidate holdings in an emergency. A secondary market emerged. If you needed money, you sold your paper share to another person. The company kept the cash, and the public traded the ownership. Meanwhile, the actual operations were run by a board of directors known as the Gentlemen 17. The thousands of citizens who bought shares had no say in how the ships were built or where they sailed. Ownership and management were now legally separated. By engineering a way to fund an expensive fleet, the VOC directors established the structural foundations of modern finance, including limited liability, tradable shares, and a permanent corporate treasury. In Amsterdam, the VOC operated as a sophisticated financial institution. In Asia, it operated as an outsourced empire. The Dutch government had granted the company sweeping sovereign powers. The corporate directors had the legal authority to build stone forts, maintain private armies, negotiate international treaties, and execute prisoners. You can see the extent of their authority right here on this copper coin. The VOC minted its own currency to run its Asian territories, stamping its corporate logo onto the money of a shadow state. That shadow state found its most ruthless leader in Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Koen. Koen was sent to Batavia with a clear mandate: secure absolute monopolies on the spice trade, regardless of the human cost. In 1621, Koen targeted the Banda Islands, the world's only source of nutmeg. When the local population tried to trade with the English, Koen deployed Japanese mercenaries and company soldiers to slaughter or enslave over 10,000 Bandanese people, entirely depopulating the islands. The 40% dividend payments cheering investors back in Europe were directly subsidized by state-sanctioned mass violence. The company didn't outcompete local Asian merchants. They used military force to physically remove them from the market. By the late 18th century, the VOC had dominated global trade for nearly 200 years. Yet the wealthiest entity on Earth was running out of money. This line graph maps rising expenses against revenue. Maintaining a sovereign state required massive overhead. The costs of paying 10,000 soldiers, repairing sprawling stone forts, and managing logistics climbed higher than their actual income from spices. Endemic internal corruption accelerated the bleeding. When the British Navy decimated the Dutch fleet in the 1780s, the company lost its primary shipping routes and fell into total insolvency. The sovereign powers used to establish a global monopoly eventually made the company unsustainable. A private business model could not indefinitely support the military and administrative costs of a state. On December 31, 1799, the Dutch government formally dissolved the company and absorbed its massive debts, but the legal and financial framework it created continued to spread. The VOC established the mechanics of globalization. They created the first models for corporate governance, foreign direct investment, and large-scale shareholder equity. Every publicly traded multinational corporation operating today is a direct structural descendant of the framework built in Amsterdam in 1602. The history of the Dutch East India Company proves that the corporate structure is a highly efficient engine for mobilizing capital. But it also provides a severe warning. Without strict regulatory checks and balances, a company prioritizing shareholder value above all else can easily become a machine for human exploitation.